Well, Patrick, thanks a lot for doing this.
No, I was surprised to see what you were doing. It's great. I think getting all of Bobby Dandridge, the Harvard basketball coach you did the other day, I think it's tremendous. And I hope that it'll build interest, for the northern region in terms of sports, because it's an extraordinary, I don't know what to call it. It's an amazing kind of alchemical mixture that guys popping up, great players. And to hear from you younger guys, right, is really interesting too, to see the continuity of things. Because when we started, when I was there, the Beltway wasn't even finished. Springfield was the boondocks. We were out there. There were a bunch of new schools, Edison, Woodson, Jefferson, but we were way out at the edge of it. And then to watch the integration come in and how that worked, and then how that carried forward, was fascinating.
Nova Legends started during the lockdown, and a lot of us, me and some friends started a Facebook group to kind of celebrate kind of the homegrown talent of Northern Virginia. And right away, folks started posting pictures of Patrick Toomay, things that you had done in high school for Edison, but also the fact that you played for the Dallas Cowboys. Right. And it was a name that I had heard as a young guy. I knew of Patrick Toomay had played for the Dallas Cowboys, but for some reason, I didn't know that was the same Patrick Toomay that was from Northern Virginia. Right. And, afterwards, many folks had known that you wrote a book called On Any Given Sunday. Right. Later on, there was a movie On Any Given Sunday, and you appeared in that movie. You had this great post football career, and as we'll get into later.
Right.
What's that?
There's a story between the Stone film and the novel. There's a whole story about that, which is interesting.
Yeah. We'll get into that, but it's just amazing. Well, let's go from the beginning. Your father, I guess it was Pat Toomay Sr. Played
John Toomay.
Okay, I'm sorry. It was John Toomay.
Yeah.
And he actually was one of the first pro basketball players.
Right. He was 6'8". He was a big guy. My family at that level, they're all a bunch of big guys and sports oriented. But he played in the early NBA. There's a funny story. He played for 4 teams in 3 years. So this is the early 50s. He played for the Washington Caps, Denver Nuggets, Providence Steamrollers, Chicago Stags. And it's interesting because at the time, Red Auerbach coached the Washington Caps, the Washington Capitals. They played downtown in DC. They were in an old ice rink. They put the floor down, and one of my Edison teammates went to our Auerbach basketball camp in DC, and he asked him if he'd ever heard of John Toomay, and Auerbach laughed and he said, the best thing he ever did for me was he was going to start a game down here in the arena, and when they introduced him, he came out on the stage walking on his hands. So that gave me some insight into my dad and what a hot dog he was, or could be. But he played 4 seasons for 4 different teams in 3 years. And then in the service, this is just post-Korean War a little bit, but he became the basketball coach at Andrews Air Force Base. And he knew the game. He played professionally. He knew the game. He was a big guy. He wasn't a great player, but he knew the game. And so what he did was he started recruiting other great basketball players who had gone into the military at that time. That's Cliff Hagan, All-American at Kentucky. Frank Ramsey, All-American at Kentucky. losers. So he put together this team, and they played all over the world, and they won, 50 consecutive games through that. So that was a big, I saw this, I was young growing up, but that was a big influence. Interesting thing was he was bored by basketball because he knew it. So he was far more driven by football and by baseball. He was far more interested. Basketball, okay, he knew it. He knew the game. He exhausted it within himself, and he didn't care about it so much with his kids as the other sports.
Wow. So I know he became a two-star general.
Yes.
So did he go into the service after he played professional basketball, or was that before he played basketball?
No, that was after.
Okay.
He went in the service, and then he put the Andrews. So he played basketball first, went in the service. I think there's a Sports Illustrated piece about those teams he was able to. It's still sitting out there in their archive about those teams he assembled, those service teams he assembled, and what.
Right.
And they played college teams as well, and they were pretty good. But
right.
So I grew up in the military, and we would move every 3 years, the entire time I was growing up. I think we were in DC. We came down to DC from upstate New York, Rome, New York. There was a SAC base there, Griffiths Air Force Base. He was a radar systems expert, nuclear weapons specialist in the end. But what was really interesting to me was where we were as a country in terms of integration. So we were up in Rome. It was Italian immigrants, black, white, everybody lived together. This was like 59. We were all in the same schools. We had great black athletes on the high school teams, on the basketball teams. So I was there 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. There was just the military ethic is, this is your guys, you want to do that, you work together to do that, to accomplish that goal. It doesn't matter who the personnel are. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so being up in Rome at that time, or 60, 61, 62, 63, that was the ethic. And so you sort of grew up with that. And those guys became very good friends for the rest of my life, and to this day. The Italian kids, black kids. Then you come down to Virginia. That's what happens. You got transferred to the Pentagon, and you have integration just beginning. Now, being out in the boondocks, as Edison was, along Springfield Road there, I lived in Ridgeview, which was Rose Hill area. It was Mark Twain Middle School, and then Edison was the new high school. And the athletic department was a couple of guys from Tennessee, Oliver Springs, Tennessee, this little podunk place between Nashville and Knoxville. And they had come up there. That was Carl Hensley and Bob Carson. Bob Carson was the AD. The school wasn't even finished yet. They put up, initially we practiced at Fort Belvoir, the basketball team. And it's a big, beautiful military gym. It was a big Quonset hut, glass backboards. They put up the metal clanger, fan-shaped boards in the gym. And the first thing that had to go was those clanger boards and get some glass in there. So we did that, and there were no lights on the football field. So we had this whole campaign where we sold door to door cases of light bulbs to the community, the Edison light bulbs, right? And that's how we got lights for the football field. We didn't have any. So it was that kind of beginning. And Carson and Hensley they knew what they were doing. They knew, they wanted us first class, jackets, ties on the road, blazers. And Hensley pressed, full court press every game. And so Jefferson Woodson, we play them. We had 2 black kids come in, so we were out. We had Willie Moore and Earl Marshall. They both played football, so we didn't have. That was the only African American kids we had out there. But now the redhead, as Red Jenkins, as Hensley referred to Red Jenkins, they were competitors together.
Right.
The old redhead, that's how Hensley talked about it. He went and got, he did some maneuvering to get Skip Brandon and Walter Hawkins to come out there. You know, the Hawk was 6'5" and Sky, and Brandon was more of a guard. And so that whole relationship was really, they had Goose Marston, they had David Strong, who ended up going to Vanderbilt where I was.
Mhm.
And we're still close to this day. But what was I going to say? So
Well, you were
I was going to pick up Hawkins. Hawkins went to Utah.
Yeah.
Was a star. And then the Dallas Cowboys drafted him as a free agent coming out. And we had, in 70, we had 140 players they brought in. And Hawk was one of them. And he reported for his first day of practice, and he's wearing his hip pads backwards. And he stayed there about 24 hours, you know, before he went back. But you keep running into these guys, you know.
So I mean, we're going to get back to the Cowboys in a bit. But so when you first showed up at Edison, so you're there kind of like in the early to mid 60s. It's like the birth of rock and roll. It's before the tumultuous times of the late 60s when the Vietnam War goes south, before you know RFK and MLK get assassinated. But there's a lot of change in the air. You got the Vietnam War. You got all of a sudden you got black students showing up at Fairfax County schools. So you're moving into Edison, into Fairfax County. It had to be a very interesting time to be in high school because things are changing quickly.
Right, but I think for me, the acceleration it accelerated later as I went into college.
Right.
That's when the effects of the war started to be seen. And really right in 1970, a lot of kids who didn't go to college were getting drafted and going over and coming back hurt because they didn't move beyond high school in their education. So Vietnam wasn't like World War II where it was all hands on deck. There were all these deferments, and you could get deferments, then you'd come up, you know, and they had lottery, they had a draft lottery. And if you had a high draft number, you were likely to go. And I faced this in 70 when I went down to Dallas. They had a whole strategy for dealing with the draft.
I read that in crunch time. I read it. Yeah.
Right. And it was, and you know, my dad was a military officer, and I could read. He never said anything specifically, but he was ambivalent about the Vietnam War as well, and especially having school-age kids who were might go. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't all hands on deck. It was there were these deferments, and what the Cowboys did was, I had a high number, not high, it was like 100, you know, out of 300, which was toward the bottom. So they would furnish you changes of address, which would put off a physical, because they had to track, bureaucratically, they had to track address changes before they could call you in for a physical. And I did that. And then I began to see the strategy of the organization, which was, you give these guys, you want to see if they're going to help the team. They brought in 140 players that in 70. they'd lost a couple big games to Green Bay, and they wanted to make a big push, and so they brought in these people, and I realized that they kept putting off the draft physical. So we go to training camp. I drove down there. We went to Thousand Oaks for training camp, and then my physical got put off until training camp was over and the exhibition season had ended. So that what I saw was that if I can play, I don't have to go to Vietnam. If I can't play, I'm on the next bus out of there. So that was how sophisticated they dealt with the draft down there. And it wasn't widely known. Go ahead.
No, so we're gonna get to your cowboy life, but I was curious as to what it was like at Edison. I mean, because this is earlier in the Vietnam War, things haven't gone south yet. I mean, this is Motown is getting started. There are beginning to be like Skip Brandon, Walter Hawkins. You're beginning to play against black players. That didn't happen just a year or two earlier. So there had to be, obviously the Vietnam War is going to really affect your life later on. But at Edison, what was going on in your mind? All of a sudden, you're playing against different guys than you had played against just 2 years earlier.
That's a great point. So Hensley and Carson, they saw what was coming. Mm-hmm. And so what they started to do, and we only had we had Willie Moore and Earl Marshall. We didn't have Brandon, we didn't have all those other players. Wakefield, Harvey Crittenden, those guys. Was happening there quicker. And so what he did was that he scheduled a series of scrimmages with Eastern, all black. Mm-hmm. And no publicity. Official officials would come in and we would scrimmage, clock, live, fouls, by ourselves with the Eastern guys. And they had a guy named Louis West. Louis West was 6'5". He was center forward. And we started playing him. I was guarding Louis. And the first quarter, second quarter, early in the first quarter, there was a foul shot, right, by Eastern. And I was on the inside of the lane. And the ball hit the back of the rim and came off. And so I stepped in to check Louis, who put his hand on my shoulder, went up, took the ball, slam dunked it, and it hit me right square in the face. And Hensley called timeout. And we come over there and he looks at me and goes, "Welcome to the big leagues. What are you going to do about it? You need to ratchet up your game. These are men you're playing with. This is, and I was 6'5" myself, but Louis West." So the interesting segue was, so that was the introduction, and it was eye-opening. It was like, holy shit.
Was the change?
Let me take it one more step.
Sure.
So I get recruited by Vanderbilt. Mm-hmm. Vanderbilt was an academic school. They were the doormat of the SEC. They had a great basketball program. Their football program was stellar. But go down there and coming from upstate New York, and then beginning to get this education on what the SEC wasn't integrated. I didn't know that. So I show up there and we got Perry Wallace and we got Godfrey Dillard from Detroit, Perry Wallace from Nashville, but both African Americans. And we're going to integrate the SEC. And I'm just thinking, what? Nobody told us this, And so we started practice. I could play both sports. I had to play both sports and then choose one. So I was out there basketball. We start, and Perry was 6'5", and he could touch the top of the square above the rim. And I thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic. I've got somebody like Louis West is on my team now, and we're going to go get him, And of course, that's a whole other story. What happened with Godfrey? What happened with Perry? The difficulties he had as we started to play in the South as freshmen. It was awful. It was a frigging nightmare.
Right. So, but at Edison in football, was the tension there also on the football field when you started, when black players, African Americans, started entering the league is just as there is in basketball? So Edison,
No.
what kind? Okay.
No, it just wasn't there. We didn't see it. Basketball was more in the public's consciousness. Football is a bunch of guys running around. And so it wasn't, black players weren't having the impact in football that they were having in basketball.
Right. So you decide to go to Vanderbilt. And from what I understand is one of your teammates at Edison, you talked Vanderbilt into also giving him a scholarship, because you could have gone anywhere and played football. I mean, the biggest programs in the country wanted you, but you went to Vanderbilt, and part of the reason why is because you're a teammate.
Yeah, Kurt Chesley was his name, and he was a multi-sport athlete at Edison too. He was a wrestler. He played baseball, and he was football, wrestling, and baseball. And I was on the baseball team, and he played center field. And he wasn't particularly fast, but he had in hands. He had hands like wet clay, so the thunk. Anything, he could catch anything. And then as a center fielder, he could be running back, and he just had tremendous body consciousness. But he was slow, but he was just relatively slow, and he didn't have any offers, scholarship offers anywhere. And I was being recruited from all over, and I was having difficulty making up my mind. My family was California. I spent a lot of time there. So Stanford and UCLA, I was being recruited by them. My family was saying, what, but I didn't want to do what they wanted, And finally I said and the Vanderbilt recruiters were relentless. And finally I said to them, Kurt Chesley is a tremendous talent, and nobody's looked at him. Nobody. You guys take a look at him, and if you like what you see, and if you take him, then I'll go with him. And so they did, and he was. Of course, he went on to be an all-SEC receiver. Wow. Then his brother went there and went to an all-SEC, and then his third brother went there. So it really changed the whole family's life, Oh. And I always loved that. I went from quarterback to safety to stand-up linebacker to defensive end. I went through all this before I finally settled down. Kurt went in there, and he was an instant star in the SEC, So, and we had a reunion recently. Kurt was there. It was great.
Okay, so you guys, so you were probably let's say a 6'5", 200-pound football player, and as a freshman, freshmen at the time had to sit out and play just against freshmen, so football and basketball, and you played both. And were you pretty certain that your future was in football?
Well, yeah,
immediately?
Because I was a 6'5" pivot man, and you go to college and you got 7 footers, and my game was all underneath. It was bang the boards and play underneath. I didn't have my outside shot was marginal. I could take it, but I was an underneath guy, and there's just no. And then I saw Perry, right? Same 6'5", but to the stars. Right. And I thought my best chances, whereas in football, you got a 6'5" lineman, that's not so, it's rare. You know, you don't find, and then I could run. I was about 210, 215. And, you know, I could run a 4.7 40, which was, you know,
pretty good.
which was good for a big man.
Yeah.
So I thought my chances of going anywhere and doing anything were better if I just went to football. So I chose football.
And were you ambitious? And here you are at Vanderbilt, which is, you know, at the bottom of the SEC. You know, you're a football and basketball player. You're still trying to find a position that you're going to settle on. I mean, eventually you're going to be the leading pass rusher in the NFL. But at the time, you're strong safety or outside back. So were you ambitious? Did you know that football was your future? Yeah.
I know that I would have a chance at that size, but the program was horrible. The program was so horrible. And Vanderbilt was a strong academic school. And I was in the engineering school. Perry and I were in the engineering school together. And so there was that too. My dad was an electrical engineer and all that. So that's why I went there, because it was good academics. They made no allowances for athletes. There were no programs for athletes like at every other state school and everywhere, right? And so there was no place to hide. So when you came in there, and that's why they were at the bottom, because you had to have some athletic ability and academic ability to go there, whereas other places, nobody cared, you know. And so in the South, they started to recruit in the North because everybody in the South knew that. So any prospect from Alabama, from Florida, they're going to go to an SEC school that's not Vanderbilt, because they got stadiums that hold 80,000 and you don't have to go to class, right? So I like that part of it, but it was hard getting, you know, we did upset Alabama. Which was we had that reunion a few years ago of that team, which was a lot of fun. But
that was Bear Bryant, but I was also Danny Ford.
Yeah, Danny Ford.
Clemson coach was on that Alabama team. Is that correct?
Yeah, now that's a piece of information not very many people know. I played over Danny Ford. So he was about 6'3" or 4, and wiry as hell, as Bears linemen were. I went to Vanderbilt. I chose Vanderbilt because of an associate of my father in the Air Force went there. His name was Jerry Moore, J.P. Moore, and he played for Red Sanders in the 40s, you know. And so he was always agitating. His son, Jerry, played for the Bears. He went to Arkansas. But as kids, we lived next door to each other in upstate New York. And so we were always hearing Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt. And so that had some weight for me. You know, anyway, I jumped on you there.
Yeah. So you upset Alabama, and did you guys go to bowl games while you're at Vanderbilt? Did you guys
we didn't make a bowl. I went to the blue-gray game as an all-star game, which were basically NFL recruiting. They wanted to see certain players in certain positions, and so some of those all-star games were for the more or less organized by the NFL to see. And that's when they wanted to see if I could play down lineman. I was drafted in the middle rounds by Dallas. They felt that I would be a down lineman. I was playing at 215, 220. They wanted me at 250. Can you do that? Will you gain the weight? You know? And so from senior year on, so I said, 6th round, you know, wasn't.
Do you think the game? So you know, you're a very normal sized guy. You were tall, but you weren't enormous. No. You weigh 215 pounds. That's not much more than I weigh right now.
Right, but then I had to play line in the NFL for Dallas. I had to go to 250. 250,
yeah, but still, that's
right.
That's not. Do you think the game is a better game today? Because you know the linemen are 320, the linebackers are 240. I mean, do you think the game is better today than it was when you played? I mean, you
Today,
guys, I mean, uh,
go ahead.
no, I mean, you guys were, even though you're bigger than the normal person is, you guys were, were very normal size in
Right.
general. Yeah.
I think the game's the pinball now. It's not, in those back then, teams would run 25, 30 running plays a game and throw 12 times, throw 15 times. It was this run dominated game. And now it's, as I said, it's pinball. It's ding, 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 boom, boom, boom. The passing game, speed. And they've changed a lot of rules. And they started to do that back then in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Holding, that kind of,
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what it would be like to play in this game. You have to be it's fast. It's always, something's always a premium on receivers, on quarterbacks. You don't see many sacks.
So after the blue-gray game, you got drafted by the Cowboys. So and you talked a little bit about how they helped some of their players avoid the draft. Could you have known? Now the Cowboys had some success in the mid to late '60s. They had faced the Packers in the championship game a couple times. So Tom Landry had built a great team. But during the '70s, when you were there, Cowboys became more than just a great football team. They became icons. They became almost a symbol for America. The Cowboys cheerleaders. NFL itself had gained prominence. Did you have any idea what you were getting into when you went to the Dallas Cowboys? Because it wasn't just a football team. The Dallas Cowboys, became this
Right.
international icon.
Right. No, I didn't know. Texas, football in Texas is like nowhere else. And I wasn't prepared for it. I couldn't, I don't know if you ever saw the film or read the book Friday Night Lights.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's high school. It's crazy. It's insane. And so for me, it was a real going down, playing the SEC and that. You go down there and it was beyond the beyond. A lot of it struck me as being nuts, I started keeping notes because to contend with my own cognitive dissonance, and the first year, and get to the writing piece. After my first year, rookie year, I had about 30 or 40 pages, and I gave the pages to selected family members. And as an afterthought, I sent them to the sports editor at the Nashville paper, John Bibb, who I knew fairly well, and thought he'd get a kick out of it, because it was crazy down there. And so Bibb, without my knowledge, passed them to John Sigenthaler, who was his publisher at the Tennessean. And whoops, what happened here?
I still see you.
Okay, and then Sigenthaler sent them to a buddy of his who was the editor-in-chief at W.W. Norton in New York. And then I get this letter from him saying, is there any more of this? And I said, no, but there could be. So I just continued taking notes, and in '75, Norton published The Crunch, was called. And sort of that happened. I played out my option in Dallas to go someplace else. And then the book was published, and it got me in a lot of trouble. And in retrospect, it was a book that probably should have written after I retired rather than and Schramm was very upset about it. And I played out my option. I was in Buffalo with OJ Simpson after his 2,000-yard season when the book came out. And then they read it and said, oh my God, And then I was the defensive MVP up there, and I got put on the expansion list. We can't have this going on. We can't have a player that's writing about the game. And then I got picked up by Tampa.
Yeah.
This was their inaugural season.
Yeah.
So that was an experience unto itself.
Well, but before we get to Tampa, so Peter Gent, who wrote North Dallas 40, North Dallas After 40, he was at the Cowboys between 65 and 68. He was a wide receiver and wrote a great book, obviously, about the Cowboys. So, but he portrayed Tom Landry as kind of like this guy, kind of a computer guy, by the numbers guy. And Tom Landry, for anyone who knows the guy, he played football. He was a safety himself. He was a defensive coordinator when Vince Lombardi was the offensive coordinator under Jim Lee Howell for the Giants. I mean, he's a football guy. But the way Peter Gent portrayed Tom Landry, he's like this, computer geek. And I know that you're the son of a general. How did you perceive Tom Landry? What kind of coach was he? Did you perceive him differently than Peter Gent had portrayed him in his novel?
I knew Pete, and I read his books. And I knew him, and that was Meredith. Don Meredith was his quarterback then, and then so these guys were freewheeling wild men basically, and sort of Landry sort of reacted against them, and he sort of tightened the screws. But the way Gent wrote, a lot of that was true, and you could take it however you took it. It had some people loved it, some people hated it. That discipline and that it took. So the Lombardi-Landry collision, there was a collision. Lombardi was an earthy Italian whose defense was tackle a man with the ball. And Landry was an engineer, systematic, and his system took 3 years to master because it was counterintuitive. You didn't play the guy in front of you. You keyed, as a defensive end, you keyed the guard. And so what you did was predicated on the dart. You're in the offset of the flex. And you're keying the guard. And what he does, if he pulls, you do one thing. You step inside, and then you fill in that hole. If he zone blocks straight ahead, then you take the inside shoulder of the tackle and do that. I mean, you can see his defenses and even offenses required a real kind of sophisticated, required your attention and discipline. And so not every player fit into that. I played for the Raiders at the end of my career. Not one of those guys could have played for Landry. Not one of them. Not a single one of them. Otis Sistrunk, Ted Hendricks, Yeah. They were wild. Right. They were wild men. Right. So he was an engineer, and he had that thing that the defense worked. But when he traded Herb Adderley from Green Bay, came down. Mm-hmm. Landry, he came down with Forrest Gregg and Leroy Caffey, 3 Packers who had beat the Cowboys in those championship games. Landry didn't want them there. Schramm did that. We need to see what Lombardi's doing that we're not doing, And so Landry, he was took an affront to that. That was Schramm. That was management saying, Lombardi's. Maybe we need to incorporate Lombardi here, so that. And he hated that, Landry. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was, Herb came down, and I was a rookie, and he stayed with us initially in the Holiday Inn Central, where all the rookies were, and we'd ride out to I'd give him a ride to practice every day. He didn't have his car yet. And now the integration thing is another thing we can pick up in here because it comes up. But Herb was a great guy, and he would talk about the defenses and the difference in the defenses. And I said, well, what do you think about coming down here and playing for them? He said, I'm just happy to have a chance to play. He was a consummate professional. And so we rode together, and he made all the difference as a player. He came in at corner. He was the reason we went to the first Super Bowl, which we lost, and then the next one, which we won. He was absolutely key. And that was all Landry could take, because it took a Lombardi sensibility to put him across the finish line, which he did not like. And so, what Herb played was the Lombardi defense, and Landry's defense was with the inside keys and all that. Landry called Herb's technique cluing, which in his mind was guessing. And he literally said that. And there came a time when he chewed out Herb in a team meeting in front of everybody as we're watching films, and said, "You got to play your keys in my defense. You can't do this cluing stuff." And he said, "Well, I don't play like that." And he said, "Well, you won't play then. I stay or leave. I don't care." This is in front of everybody. So outside of Landry's personality, it's unbelievable. And Herb got up and he left the meeting, but he wasn't going to sacrifice his salary, so he played the scout team the rest of the season. This was a proud guy, from Philly. And so I've written about this in another place, about his about that conflict. So that was it. Now while I'm thinking about that.
Sure.
In Dallas, Black players could not live in North Dallas, where all the apartments were and everything else. There was
Is that why Peter Gent called it North Dallas
Yes.
For someone who's not from Dallas,
right.
Why would you make that distinction?
That's why.
That's why. Okay.
North Dallas was white, South Dallas was black, Oak Cliff, and so Black players could not. The practice field was in far North Dallas, right? You'd have to go. It's 15 or 20 miles. They'd have to go. All the white players lived half a mile from the practice field. All the Black players lived in South Oak Cliff, 30 miles away. And Mel Renfro, great cornerback, he came in and he had to sue. He was from Oregon, So his sensibility was of somebody from Oregon who isn't living this Texas crap. And so he comes and he says, "I'm not living that. Look at all these apartments right here. I can be at the practice field in 5 minutes. Why do I have to go down there?" He filed suit, he won. And this was the beginning of the assault on that kind of prejudice in Dallas. This is 70, 71, this is absurd that this kind of thing is ruling a community. Yeah. All the other guys lived down there. They would make they didn't fight it. It took Mel and it took Herb to, who they didn't give a hoot. They knew what was right and they moved toward it. So another interesting sidelight there.
Yeah. So I recently interviewed Grant Hill, and as you know, one of your teammates in Dallas was Calvin Hill.
Oh yeah.
And he was one of my favorite players. I was born in '66, and I was 6 or 7. Calvin Hill was one of the Cowboys' star running backs. What was Calvin Hill like?
Well, he was extremely intelligent. He was extremely talented. In fact, I saw Calvin recently. There was a screening of a film about Terry Wallace in DC, and I went with David Marinus and his wife, and Calvin came with Mark Washington, who was a Cowboy cornerback as well. Mm-hmm. Calvin lives in the area, and so we had a great time talking about it. And of course, Grant is Grant, he had trouble. He also, he went to Yale, smart, and he had difficulty with the entire system. And he ended up doing what I did, which only more successfully. When the World Football League came along, he signed for a big contract. I tried to sign with somebody, but they fell apart before I could get out. But he's a fine guy, great dad. Of course, Grant is Grant, and he was annoyed some of the other players, but he was who he was, you know.
One of the great players of the time, and you were drafted in the same class as him, was Duane Thomas. And Duane Thomas had a very famous, they call it the quiet season. He didn't talk to anybody. So when he was a rookie, you know, he was looked upon as being maybe one of the greatest running backs to come along, and he was projected to have a great career, but it never worked out for him. What happened to Duane Thomas? And was it just he got caught up in the whole Dallas thing that you're talking about?
Well, there was a lot of, I think Jim Brown, the great, he became his advisor, and it was again, I think it went into the teeth of what the Cowboys wanted. He felt silent. He wouldn't do publicity. And he and I were roommates initially when the first rookie class came down there in '70, because alphabetically we were Toomay Thomas. We were next together. So, and it was fine. Fun weekend. It was testing you on this, that, and the other. It was like in February or something. Then I went to check out, and he had made about $200 worth of long distance calls under my name. And I said, he was the number 1 draft choice. I was the number 6, you know. And so I said to Brant, I'm not going to room with him again after that. And so whatever happens, you know, you can give me a single room when we come back or not. But I don't want to live with a guy who's charging on my card his stuff, you know. And so we went apart, but it didn't. I took it with a grain of salt. He was a great talent. He was smart, and I think he was radicalized and probably ill-advised after that season. He went to San Diego. I think his career would have been much longer. He was a tremendous talent. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So one of the things you did as a Cowboys, you joined what was called the Zero Club, and the Zero Club they were interested in getting no publicity. Blaine Nye, I think Larry Cole were part of the Zero Club. And it's interesting because in those days of playing football, you guys didn't make the kind of money that players make today. So you would think publicity would be good because it would help you get your off-season gigs, make some more money. So what was the Zero Club, and why did you join it, and did it benefit you?
It didn't. Well, it was very funny. So in that way, it broke some spell of seriousness that was going on there. And there was no joining or it just sort of spontaneously arose. I was a rookie, and everybody, on Saturdays, everybody would dress up, and it was disco time. Everybody had their bell bottoms, and they'd have dates, and they'd go off to town. And the guys who were rookies who were playing well, it was party time basically, but that never appealed to me too much. I was staying in one Friday night, and I happened to wander down the hall and stepped into Cole's room and Nye's room, and Cole, they were just sitting there. Everybody was, I said, the movie was How to Frame a Fig with Don Knotts. That was the movie in Thousand Oaks. Everybody had gone there. I said, you guys, you don't want to do that, huh? We said, no. And Cole, I think it was, look, well, he was comatose, but Nye looked over and said, welcome to the Zero Club. So it was a sort of situation of, we're not them, where this is what we are. And then this whole thing grew out of that, which is very funny and was a great, the columnist, Frank Alexa, there was a Dallas columnist named Frank Alexa who perpetuated that for years. He would get stuff out of it. So it was very funny, but it was just that. It was nothing more.
Yeah. So during your time in Dallas, the Dallas-Washington rivalry was born, and it's still a big rivalry to this day. And I'm talking about the Redskins because we are locally based here in the DC area. So, but Vince Lombardi had come to Washington, then he unfortunately died afterwards. And then George Allen came, and he brought the Over the Hill gang, lots of veterans like Billy Kilmer, Chris Hamburger, Mike Curtis. He put together this team of veterans in DC. What's your recollection of that rivalry, and what do you think about those Redskin teams of the early 70s?
Well, they were great. They were so much fun, and having grown up and been to DC Stadium and all that, it was. And my first start was in DC Stadium against the Redskins with Jurgensen and those guys. And Landry, it drove Landry. George Allen drove Landry nuts. And our practice field in North Dallas, there was a motel that abutted the practice field. And every Washington week, they would rent up all the top floor hotel rooms because they were absolutely convinced that George Allen had people up there stealing the game plan, So that was the thing. And I started there in 70. I had to play, Cole broke his hand. I had to play left end out of position. And it was a great thrill for me. Hensley came to the game. Carson came to the game. My folks. And so it was a big deal. Larry Brown was running. They were tough. They were good.
They're a good team.
Yeah. And playing in that game and contributing to the win, and it was great.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you wrote a book called Crunch Time, and it may have hastened your departure of Dallas, but also they drafted a guy named Ed Too Tall Jones, who's a famous pass rusher, and in a time in the NFL where there wasn't much passing, as you said before, it was more of a running game. They didn't even count sacks until the early 80s. But you were a pass rusher. So you ended up leaving Dallas and going to Buffalo, and you had one of your best years ever in the NFL.
Yeah, it's I don't know. Football's a funny game. When they, I'd led Dallas in sacks, and then they drafted Ed, great guy, a giant, 6'8", and Harvey Martin. And it takes 3 years to learn the defense there, and when you get the other team in a passing situation, that's the only time when you can blow and go. And so what they did, these guys, they were having difficulty learning the defense, as we all did. And so I had led the team in sacks, and then the next year, here comes Harvey and Ed, and I'm sitting on so if we play the run defense, I play one down a series, or two at the most. And then they come in and it's just, and I didn't like that situation much. I thought I wasn't, so I played out my option, but also simultaneously the book came out, so which would have hastened it anyway. and then went on to Buffalo. And then, as I said, the book came out during that season and they didn't like it. So it was off to Tampa with their 0-14 first season NFL debut. Steve Spurrier was on that team. Yeah.
Right.
And
So I want to get to Tampa in a minute, but one Cowboy I forgot to ask you about, and that's Roger Staubach. So back in those days, if you went to Navy, the Naval Academy or West Point, you had to serve 4 years before you became a professional
right.
to play pro football. So Roger Staubach did his 4 years. He may have even gone to Vietnam. I don't remember, but he joined the Cowboys after 4 years of service.
Right.
And they had, as you mentioned earlier, Craig Morton had led the Cowboys to the Super Bowl in '71. What was Roger Staubach like? And did you have a lot of respect for him as a player?
Oh yeah, oh sure. As being from the DC area when he was there, when he was at Navy, I was recruited by Navy as well, all the service academies, and so he was a great guy. He was a great talent. I think Landry felt that he wasn't. He would tuck the ball and run too often, that he wouldn't stay with his keys. But that's all adjusting to the complexities of the NFL versus college. But he was an enormous talent, and there was that they would rotate the quarterbacks like pulling guards, and Craig didn't like that much. And eventually Craig was sent to Denver, and then Roger took over the team, and then it was high flying from that point on. He was an amazing player, and he's a great guy. In the locker room, knew him personally, knew his kids. Mary Ann, his wife, was wonderful. And he's still there. Still.
So you were in Buffalo when OJ Simpson was there, and I'm not. OJ played offense, you played defense, and you're probably just there trying to put your head down and do your job. Did you get to know OJ Simpson well? And
A little bit.
Yeah.
A bit. Oh yeah. No, he was available to the guys, but he was like no other player I'd ever been around in terms of stature. So Monday Night Football come, and we got Frank Gifford and Howard Cosell in the locker room talking it up with OJ. He was a golden boy. He was a star like nobody else around. And then he would do there was a certain social circle. He'd move with the SC guys. Bobby Chandler was a player. Bubby Braxton was a fullback. So he had kind of his social life was that of a star, of a media star. He would do signings. But as in the locker room, he was a regular guy. But he could do. What would he do? I just had it that left me. He would be treated in certain ways that nobody else, that you never see anybody get treated in the locker room. And the coaches treated him the same way. Lou Saban was the coach. They deferred to him in ways that you never saw anywhere else ever.
It's hard to win that way. So you end up going to Tampa Bay in the expansion draft. Tampa Bay, that's the famous season where they win no games, and John McKay is the coach. But then you get a lifeline, and you end up going to the Oakland Raiders, and you get a chance to play for John Madden. And that must have been a kind of exciting but crazy time playing for John Madden in the late 70s.
Ron Wolf was the general manager of the Tampa team, and he was the personnel director previously at Oakland. And he and McKay was, he got worse and worse as the season went on, and things got worse, as you can imagine. And then what we tried to do on defense is just play hard. It doesn't matter because people are watching. You know, I mean, I don't mean the fans. I mean people. You know, staff. They're going to see we play as hard as we can. And that's the approach we went on defense. We were fairly decent on defense until things flew apart. And then the next year, I got ready to drive to training camp. It was a physically to play 0-14. We couldn't quite stop anybody. So we were on the field sometimes 80, 90 plays a game. That's 2 seasons in one. We were a good defense. We had Leroy Selman. We had the Dewey Selman. We were almost good. You know, we were a little short, but we couldn't quite stop anybody. And so that's 2 seasons in one. And that's just a killer for a defensive player if you're out there all the time. So the next season, I drove down to Tampa to report for training camp, and the closer I got to the city, the slower I drove until finally when I got into the city limits, I couldn't report. I realized I couldn't report, and you know, and they paid well. They paid well. I had 2 kids, two young kids, so I stopped at the motel at the Holiday Inn, and I called my wife and I said, "Honey, I can't do it. I can't report. I drove all the way here and I can't do it." And she said, "You don't have to. You've been traded to the Raiders." I said, "What?" And then the Raiders were just coming off winning the Super Bowl. And so I went in, got my equipment. Abe Gibron, the Chicago guy, he was the defensive lineman coach. I said, "Abe, I'm getting my stuff. I'm going to the Raiders." He said, "What?" You can't, you know. So it was like, and Bob Moore, who was the tight end at Tampa that year, he had come from the Raiders too, and he said, "You lucky bastard," you know. So I went home, drove back to Dallas, got on the plane, flew up there, and then the Raiders trained at the El Rancho Tropicana Motel, which is up in Santa Rosa, and they had the back of it. They took over the back half, and they had a field back there. And I drive up there, and the guy who picked me up took me into the coach's office and met Madden. And he said, "Now let me get this straight. You drove to Tampa, you reported there, you found it, then you drove all the way back to Dallas, then you flew here to come to camp here." And he said, I said, "Yeah, it was." He said, "You must be exhausted." And I said, "Well, I am." He said, take a couple days off and report when you're ready. Come out when you're ready." Well, that was my first clue that John Madden, he had put himself in my position. He's understood what I'd gone through. So instead of saying, "Suit up and get your ass out there," which is the response of 90%, 99% of anybody else, he said, "You're exhausted, take a break." And I said, "This is a special guy." Right there from that instant, you know. And then he put me with roommate Dwayne Benson, who had played for him early, gone and played for Atlanta. He was at the end of his career, but he then filled me in on the whole thing. And it was like dying and going to football heaven, basically.
So is the key to Madden's success is players really like him and feel like he's got their back and he's one of them?
He's got your back. And what he wants you to do is to play hard. That's it. Play hard.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Know the defense, play hard. And
Right.
just personally, he was personally curious. you come in and he'd be sitting at your locker having a cup of coffee, and he'd ask about your wife, your girlfriend, the car you're driving, what happened here, it was just, he established a relationship with all the players, and he knew them, and he could talk to them like people, not like soldiers or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was just nothing like it, and everybody responded to it. And there were some characters on that team, but every one of them would jump off the cliff for him. They would walk the plank for John Madden. Everybody, every single one of them. And you could see it when he became a broadcaster, the goofball part of him. But that's how he was. And playing for him was like, I only got him 1 year, but it really, and I led the league that year in sacks because it was such the perfect environment to play in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you had this career where, I mean, you had tremendous success. I mean, you probably would have been remembered more for your success if they actually would have counted sacks for all the years you played.
Right.
Again, it wasn't an official statistic until after you retired.
That's
But
right.
one thing that's amazing about your career is that you never missed a game. What do you attribute that to? The fact that you were able to be so durable and I mean, NFL is a very dangerous business.
Yeah, it is.
How is that possible?
I think I had surgery at Vanderbilt my senior, and I did have a procedure while I was playing. It was mostly knees, and then at retirement, after retiring, I had to have some knee work done. I just think the players weren't as big as they were now, so the collisions weren't the same. And I was agile. I'd played basketball. I was agile for my size. And I think in Oakland at the end, the last 3 years out of 10, I was a situation player. And I think that really helped. Had I had to go to Tampa again after playing 90 plays a game for a season, I doubt if I would have made it through the next season. As it happened, I went to Oakland and became a situation player, which isn't the same wear and tear, particularly on passing downs or passing situations. So I think it was that, and I think I was lucky too.
Well, you played in the NFL in the 1970s, and that was like the birth of Monday Night Football. That's when football became the national pastime and replaced baseball as the #1 sport. Did you get a sense when you were doing this that this is a very exciting time to be in the NFL, or were you just just doing your job and trying to get it paid?
Well, I think the appeal of Monday Night Football, what that did to the game, all of that was exciting. But I didn't have a sense. I don't think very many people had a sense of the through line that the league was moving on, that this development, where it was going. You just showed up, did your job, and went on. But it was exciting. It was fun.
Right. So when you retired, I mean, you've been retired for 40 years.
Don't say that.
Players,
Don't say that.
Oh, sorry about that.
No.
But nowadays players make so much more money, so they retire, and if they're smart, they may not have to ever earn again. But you retired at a time when players didn't make tons of money. A lot of them worked in the off season in jobs. You had 40 years with which to keep yourself busy, and I mean, you're very fortunate that you're a gifted writer and you had some interesting projects. So what about? Maybe talk a little bit about some of your retirement projects, some of the things you've done over the last 40 years or so to keep yourself busy.
I've never thought of it in that frame. That's pretty fun. I think one thing that's keeping me busy now since March, the pandemic, there was a newspaper guy in Nashville where Vanderbilt went to school named John Sigenthaler. And John Sigenthaler was in the Tennessee, and he was in the JFK Justice Department in the early civil rights movement. He was sent down to Selma, Alabama. He was the only federal person to send down there. He got his head cracked open down there while trying to do, the service of the federal government in that chaotic situation. He then, when JFK was assassinated, he became Robert Kennedy's. He was a Kennedy Democrat. He became Robert Kennedy's campaign guy, and of course, he was lost too. He went on to become the publisher of the Nashville Tennessean, and he was brilliant. And he had a program called A Word on Words, that went on for 40 years, in which on Nashville Public Television, which was broadcast all around the South, he would interview authors about their books. 900 interviews. And so a few of us who benefited from his generosity and spirit, he passed a few years ago. We've called, of those 900, we've called 25. And for Vanderbilt University Press, we're doing, there's a whole section on civil rights, music, Nashville, sports. And he got The Crunch published, I think I did, right? I mentioned what he did to get it. And so this is sort of payback for that. There are two other guys who's benefited singularly as well. And we're all working together to put this compilation together. I've over the years, I read for close writer friends who are doing big projects, edit, make comments. Publishing industries change. Writers have to assemble their own team to get the work needed done. The publishers don't do that kind of work anymore, except in very rare circumstances. So I've been doing that, raising kids. Nothing. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, well, you wrote a book called On Any Given Sunday, which I had mentioned earlier. And later on, Oliver Stone was involved in a project called Any Given Sunday. And the story wasn't based on your book, but somehow you were invited to the screening. You were given a cameo as a defensive assistant, I guess, under Y.A. Tittle, the famous giant quarterback.
Right.
And then it turns out a scene that was described in your book ended up in the movie. So you kind of begin to understood why maybe Oliver Stone wanted to have you on your side. Did I kind of describe that correctly?
I'll send you. I wrote a piece about the whole thing, which made Best American Sports Writing, the whole thing.
Oh, awesome.
I'll send it to you. He didn't know. He when he made the film and had the script written, he just thought On Any Given Sunday was the cliche of the league. Any given Sunday, any team can beat any other team. And then my novel takes another approach to that. It goes into gambling, and on any given Sunday, any given team can beat any other team because there's a lot of crap going on in the background, right? And so when the film was announced, I was surprised so I wrote him a note about I said, there's a novel of the same name. And he was shocked. It was basically the producer, Clayton Townsend, was shocked. And so he said, he then read the novel and said, well, these two stories are not the same. So we really don't, there's nothing to be done about that. So then I was disappointed. And then about 3 weeks later, he writes back and he says, listen, we've been thinking about this. And I then researched, he said, how would you like to be in the movie? We want you to play Y.A. Tittle's assistant. Well, I then talked to my brother-in-law who's in the film business, and he said, you can't protect a title. And he said, they want to prevent a lawsuit should you decide to sue them. So they're giving you a few grand and putting you in the movie. And so I said, that makes sense. I said, so I did it. And it was just fascinating. Talking to Y.A. Tittle, talking to Jim Brown, getting the perspective on this stuff. And what Stone was doing was not, none of us were in concert with what he was doing, with what he was presenting, so it was very funny hearing the opinions of these guys, right? Tittle, Brown, on, of course, Jim Brown was trying to he was an actor, he was aging at that time, so he was thrilled to have a job in the industry. And so I did write that up, and it was the whole thing was fascinating and fun.
One day Jim Brown is kissing Raquel Welch in movies, and next day he's playing the aging line assistant coach, and he's very happy to be doing so. Right. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
And then there was I tried to call him after it was over. I wanted to make sure I had something right. And it was right. I was calling at the moment he was in this whole ruckus with his ex-wife, having beat her car with a baseball bat. I thought, oh my God. But it was fun, and I got a good piece of writing out of it, and no money, but so it goes.
Yeah. So I think this spring or this summer you're working on a new project. Is this something you can talk about, or is it something?
Well, that was what I was going to with Siegenthaler. So Siegenthaler had this program for 40 years where he interviewed authors about their books. He did 900 interviews. So it was called A Word on Words. And so those of us who benefited from his generosity of spirit, which I did for sure, he would interview people about their work, and they were like no other interviews you'd ever have. He was brilliant. He was a polymath. And so what we decided to do was to take transcripts from 25 of the best of the 900 and put them in print form with commentary from the other two people who are working with me on it, or I'm working with them. And so that's the project, that's the book. And I finished my piece of it, doing editing these conversations, picking out from the 900. And that's, there's a number of interviews of civil rights leaders. You've learned a lot from, I've learned so much that I didn't know about the movement, for example, just from reading these in-depth conversations with these guys. So I do that. And as I said, I read for people, and that keeps me occupied.
Right. Well, look, Patrick, it's been great, talking to you. You had an amazing career. I mean, not only were you just a fantastic basketball player, football player, all the way to the NFL. You wrote books. I mean, you have the kind of career that most people dream about, and it's just part of who you are. So you don't seem too high on yourself. You just seem to go about your business, which is very admirable. But it's been great to get to know you on our group. I'm so pleased that you've participated, because you're a big name. A lot of the old timers like Michael McKinley and Derek Hensley, who was Carl Hensley's son.
Right.
These people know exactly who you are. So I want you to know that we really appreciate your input and the fact that you've been a member of our group.
Julian, I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate the depth of your research and knowledge. It's it's rare. You don't find it. You don't find people who care that much, and who look into it in the depth that you have. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I hope it starts to build you're getting good people on, and I think that's well worth the time. And I know you're having some fun too.
Yeah. Well, thanks for those kind words, and it's fun to get to know people like yourself. And I watched you play when I was young. I just had no idea you're one of us. You're from Northern Virginia, so yeah. But hopefully you'll keep involved, and I'd love to keep in touch if you're ever in
Sure.
the DC area. Maybe
Sure.
grab a coffee and,
Sure.
and actually meet in person.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Appreciate it.
Well,
Thanks.
great. Well, look, I took a lot of your time. Thanks again, Patrick. And
Pleasure's mine.
let's keep in touch.
All right, Drew. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
We'll see
Thanks
you
again.
later. Yeah.
Yeah, you too.